So for me, I've learned this new SAT word this year, which is nadir, which means that, that's the bottom of the trough. So I encourage you all to use it. It's kind of fun, N-A-D-I-R. I didn't really know it before the Great Recession. So I'm going to run through a few of these slides at the beginning. This is from a new paper that came out on Friday, where I'm looking at unemployment within married couples. And so it's a slightly different angle than what they've spoken about. And I just want to start off with a chart that should be familiar to you all, that the share of married dual earner families, of course, has risen from about a third of all families with children to 4 in 10. It's sort of the largest group, but I just wanted to show this chart at the beginning to say I recognize that they're not, just because they're the single largest doesn't mean they're the only or the most important, but that's what the paper I wrote is about. So just, it's one slice of the story, and one that I think has some interesting trends. So I have a couple of slides, but one thing I wanted to just go back to this one. This is really hard to turn, by the way. So both Eileen and Heidi have made this point, making it in a slightly different way. And on Friday, when the jobs numbers come out, we have this little interactive where you can go and hit play, and you can show how jobs have been lost or gained over the recovery by gender, which is super. It's kind of fun and cool if you're into that sort of thing. This is sort of what the end it shows out, but then you can sort of see where men and women are losing by industry in a graphical rather than a table format. So I just wanted to pop that up there. And now I will move on to the slightly different topic of married couples and unemployment. So, here's I'm using some CPS data that only goes back to '79. So I'm comparing basically, for the most part, the early '80s recession with today's recession. And there's a couple of things that are really important and really different between today and the early '80s. As I know, all of us in this room know, we saw this rapid increase and sustained increase in women's labor force participation. The trends that we're talking about today in terms of unemployment for families, this is the first real deep recession, thankfully, where the typical married couple family has had both adults in the labor force rather than just one. So when we're thinking about these unemployment rates by gender, that has real implications for how families are coping. Back in the early '80s, if he lost his job and more couples just had him working, maybe they could move. Of course, you didn't have the housing crash, which makes it a little bit easier to move back then as well. Whereas today, she's got a job, makes it a little bit harder in terms of the labor market. You don't have as much flexibility on the one hand, but you do have her in the labor force. So there's some interesting different policy implications. So I think this is an important population to look at. But there are a lot of these couples that have both spouses unemployed, and of course you see this really big increase in one spouse unemployed and one spouse working over the Great Recession. Now, historically, it has been the case that among married couples, it was more likely that the wife was the one unemployed rather than the husband was the one unemployed. That was the trend. So wife working, husband unemployed is the red line, and the husband working, wife unemployed is the blue line. That is, of course, the big change that's happened in this recession, where you saw this sharp uptick and bigger than the gap that you saw in the early 1980s in families where she is working and he is unemployed. For those of us that care about the gender pay gap, I think this is an incredibly compelling message point. There could not be a more important time in America to focus on making sure that she is earning a fair day's pay, because she is supporting more families, especially in married couples, than they have historically. Now, one thing about this, Eileen and Heidi have already gone over some of the gender differences, and as Eileen pointed out, men lost 7 out of 10 jobs that were lost during the Great Recession. And on the one hand, it makes sense then that it's more likely in married couples that he's out of work and she's working. However, there's a little bit of empirical reality when you compare across recessions that gets in the way. In the early 2000s recession, men actually lost 86% of the jobs. In the early 1990s recession, they lost 98% of the jobs. And in the early 80s recession, women gained jobs while men lost jobs. So in some sense, this chart, from my perspective, doesn't make a lot of sense. Because historically, men have always lost more jobs in recessions going back to the early 80s. Prior to that, by the way, it was the other way around, but that at this point is kind of ancient history. We can, that's a different topic, but anyway. But it is interesting how it shifted. So I think that the answer, which is I think slightly complex, but one way of thinking about this is that one of the things that's happened is that we know that because of the lack of demand, and Eileen already focused on this, because we have not seen economic growth, because we have this massive demand gap right now, people, once they're losing their jobs, quite frankly, they're just screwed. They're not getting back into the labor force. They're just sitting out there in the unemployment queue. We have historically high unemployment rates, and those men that have lost jobs are not getting them back. Here too, there's a little bit of a fact problem because men were always more likely than their wives to be long-term unemployed, but the historically high level of long-term unemployed, and what I didn't show up here is that you've also seen record high numbers of men leaving the labor force in this recession, just quite frankly giving up, dropping out. They're not going to be in this chart because they're home watching Fox News, unfortunately. Or at least that's my hypothesis, otherwise nothing makes sense. When you look at the data from the Displaced Worker Survey, which looks at people who've lost their job in the past 3 years because their plant closed or layoffs or something, the reemployment figures are super depressing, so I'm going to give those to you. Back in 1994, 65% of men who lost their jobs within the past 3 years were back at work. Today that figure is 40%. Back in 1994, 51% of women who'd lost their jobs within the past 3 years were back at work. Now that number is 38%. So the reemployment for men over between 94 and that, I don't have that data going back earlier, and that data, by the way, is another CPR data point. This is from a new study that John Schmidt's going to be releasing soon, I'm not sure when. But that shift from 65% to 51% reemployment for men, I think explains why male unemployment has been so high among married couples. So, so I want to go, and okay, so one point I want to make on this. So one of the narratives that we heard a lot about in the 2000s was that as the recovery happened and women did not get jobs in that recovery, you saw, and I have a chart on that, but I won't go back to it, you saw all of these news stories about how women were voluntarily opting out of employment. When the real story is that women really never recovered from that early 2000s recession. And there's work on that I'm happy to point you to. I think that one of the things that we're likely to see over the next 2 to 5 years is a somewhat similar narrative. As families are struggling with all the things that Eileen was talking about, cutbacks at the state and local government, losing a lot of women's jobs, and at the same time losing the services that make it easier for families to have dual earner families, you're going to see a lot of women, you're going to see a lot of kitchen tables around the country, families having to make that decision. What are we going to do? That daycare center that we were used to use, like the budget's been cut, there's no after-school program, the home health aid that mom was relying on, we don't have that anymore. How are we going to cope? You're going to see some lack, I wouldn't call it voluntary, but you're going to see, I think, this narrative reemerge. So just something to watch out for the next few years and to push back on, I think, really strongly. We should start doing that now, because I don't want to do that all over again. It wasn't very fun. Okay, so 2 last charts to show. One, I broke this down by age, the older spouse, and by race. And so this is age. This chart has enormous policy application. Oh, and I apologize to those of you on the phone. We can send you the slides, by the way, from all these, I'm sure. Okay, so this looks at the shared married couples with one spouse working, one unemployed. The red is husband unemployed, the blue is wife unemployed, comparing 82 to 2010. If you look, and if I'd done some fancy graphics, I could have shown the 82 slide first. If you look at the 82, which are the sort of shaded red and blue, among older couples, they were much less likely to be experiencing unemployment, and the rate of unemployment among husbands and wives about equal. Fast forward to the 2010 recession, and the largest jump in husband unemployment between 82 and the current recession in sort of percentage terms are these older couples where one spouse is between the ages of 55 and 64. Among this group, we know that, given the demographics, that older person is more likely to be a husband. The gender gap is larger as families age, especially among this cohort where you didn't have as large of labor force participation when the women were younger. And these are the people that we're having a national conversation right now about cutting their future retirement benefits. These people as well, by the way, and note that their unemployment is a lot higher than it was in the early 1980s. And these are also the people for whom this is the first sort of cohort for whom this great national experiment that we've been running, moving from defined benefit to defined contribution plans, we've played this experiment out on these folks, and then we've sacked them with a massive, two massive housing what is the word I'm looking for? Bubbles, popping, collapses in both, 401k values and their homes, and they're experiencing this record high unemployment. And mind you, these are the married people, right? This is the good. These are the folks that probably have it a little bit better than your single folks. So when we're thinking about this conversation and putting it into some sort of economic context, I would encourage you to think about this piece of this chart in your talking points, because to sort of ground this conversation we're having right now about retirement security. I didn't realize how bad it was until I did this chart, and so that's I just wanted to show that. Oh, and by the way, for these people, they're never going to work again. I mean, I'm sorry, I don't mean to be like so gloomy, but the reemployment number for workers between ages of 55 and 64, nearly 2/3 of women and 2/3 of men who've lost their job in the past 3 years, as of 2010, were not working. And of those who were working, they have the highest share who are earning less than 20% less than their prior job. So, I find it makes me feel very emotional. This is like, we have just really, this is a very sad tale, and at the same time we're having this conversation about cutting benefits for people who are about to retire.